Welcome to IdeaGen TV. Today we're thrilled to have with us Ambassador Patrick Theros. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you very much, George. It's always a pleasure. It's a lot of fun too.
And it's always intimidating to be with you because you've got so many books behind you. And my assumption is that you've read each and every one, which is a daunting task if you're not a Luddite of some sort.
Yeah, I was burdened with the fact of being an only child whose parents wouldn't get him television.
Okay.
And as a consequence, of my 12th birthday, my mom bought me Encyclopedia Britannica, and I literally had nothing else to do in the house except read it from AA to ZZ.
Yeah, and it's so funny because today, we digress a bit, but today most kids probably don't know what the Encyclopedia Britannica is, right?
Yeah. I've still got the copy. It's over there. My wife keeps saying, "When are you going to get rid of it?" And we haven't done it yet.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you on IdeaGen TV today. We sit at the crossroads geopolitically in so many ways, but I'd like to start with asking you a question about the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations and wondering from your perspective and your vantage point, having been so well read and so well traveled across the planet, Patrick, in what ways do you believe the United States of America can further these global goals through working with other nations, including nations that you're so familiar with as having been the former ambassador to Qatar, like Qatar? What can we be doing?
I don't think we can further the goals simply by working with one country. What you need is for the United States to assemble a collective of like-minded countries. Not exactly the same, but countries that, there are 16 goals, 17 goals, countries that are committed to 7 to 10 of them and regard the other 7 as okay, which is about the best you're going to do at the beginning. It's a question of building a sufficient mass of countries around the world. They've got to be, they can't all be on one continent. Perhaps the one thing that should define these countries is a commitment to popular participation in government. Maybe don't call it democracy as we have it, but countries that have the interests of their people at heart, because their people are the ones who decide who rules them. So then once you have this coalition together, and it's not going to be the entire world, it may even, then you can start working on advancing the goals. And in some cases, some countries are better at advancing some goals, other countries at others. It has to be a coherent effort in which some countries take the lead on something. The United States, being the United States, is obviously going to bear a larger burden than almost any other country in that coalition, but you can't do it by yourself.
You can't do it by yourself.
Yeah,
that's right. You can't do it by yourself. And as a former ambassador, you've seen things that many have not. And you've been involved in so many different negotiations and dialogues, let's say, with other nations and leaders across the planet. What do you believe is the most important quality to ensure peaceful, mutually beneficial partnerships amongst nations?
A single important quality is hard, unless this is going to be a very broad definition, is you have to understand the other nation from its own point of view. What are its interests? What is its historical background? What are the particular problems we face? Let me give you an example out of current history. Right now, the EU is pushing for a complete embargo on Russian oil and later on Russian gas, which is fine in principle, but it affects different countries different ways. So before you can impose such an embargo, you have to get everybody to buy in. And sometimes the country that suffers the least, that thought up this idea because they're suffering the least, has to make some real sacrifices to help the country that's suffering the most. Good example, something like 80 or 90% of Czech gas comes from Russia. The Czech pipeline system isn't connected to any other pipeline except pipelines going to Russia. So this is a very sort of specific and narrow approach, but other countries all have their own interests at play, and you can't make doing one size fits all is very difficult unless the countries that suffer least make the sacrifices to help the countries that suffer more. Say, taking climate change. Fact of the matter is, there are countries that are going to be very badly affected by climate change and do not have the financial means to mitigate the effects. Some of the islands in the island nations in the Pacific. If we do not seriously look at how those countries are going to be and seriously help them, I mean, and this is big money would be involved. Though those countries, we're going to end up with the entire population of those countries turning into refugees someplace, which adds to instability, which causes all sorts of problems. If we don't do something to mitigate their particular loss, which is proportionally enormously much bigger than ours. I'll give you another example. Let's say, again, with climate change, again with the rise in sea levels. If you take the more extreme numbers, 2/3 of Florida disappears. Those people in Florida, originally were there because they didn't think they'd be underwater. It is the responsibility of the United States, probably as a single sovereign country, will probably do what it can to help them. But in the past, we haven't done it. We embarked on very sensible economic policies that led to the disappearance of American industry and the disappearance of jobs in American industry. We didn't think through the consequences of that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have done it, but what we didn't do was mitigate the consequences. The consequences that made the rest of us so much wealthier than we were in the past also had the consequence of costing several tens of millions of people their jobs. So if you don't take the long view, take everybody's views into consideration, you're always going to have problems. You're going to have pushback, and sometimes that pushback will prevent you from achieving your goals.
It's such a good point, and sustainability is a broad term.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there one specific goal within the global goals of the UN that stands out to you? You've mentioned several already. In terms of its urgency, I mean, climate change is one, global partnerships is another.
If you want to put it down to one, I mean, this is a package, and we should regard it as a package. But if you want to put it down to one, it would be climate change, because this one is coming, and it will affect the other 16 goals. I mean, executing the other goals in a world that has evolved to the point where life as we know it is no longer sustainable. It doesn't matter what the other goals are. So to me, that is the single most important goal we're facing. That, and let's try and avoid nuclear war, but that's a different thing.
And that's so interesting. So you aptly describe the goals as all part of a package,
right?
And yet, the climate issue is probably the most important, as you describe it, because without mitigating that, some of the other issues become irrelevant,
right?
Vis-a-vis, rising tides in water, and
Yeah, I mean, an example: food. Food will become, with climate change. I don't care how many more fancy seeds we develop and so forth. The fact is that how can I say, climate change out of control will make modern agriculture and and current fishing almost unsustainable.
It's just it's striking, it's concerning, it's disconcerting, really.
Yeah.
And I'd like to shift a bit. I like to shift because that's what we do. While the situation across the planet geopolitically and even with Ukraine is on so many levels tragic, do you believe some of the things that are happening, i.e., in Ukraine, in Russia, et cetera, do you believe this could actually become a catalyst for the global powers that be to unite in some form or fashion to support fulfilling and actually achieving perhaps the global goals as we lead into 2030?
Only if we think about the game 10 years down the line. Thinking of the Ukraine as Ukraine crisis, as we're going to defeat the aggressor, and then stopping there and whatever defeat the aggressor means, will not contribute. As a matter of fact, it will probably set it back, because what does defeating the aggressor mean? Are we just going to will we just agree on a what's the word I'm looking for, on a ceasefire in place where the Russians began? Will it be pushing the Russians back beyond all the borders of Ukraine? Will it be punishing the Russians into the future? This then has other ramifications. We are in danger, in my view, in particular in the Ukraine, of creating a bipolar world in which we push Russia with all its resources and its problems into the orbit of China, instead of drawing Russia. I mean, to me, the objective should be to draw Russia into Europe, is to make Russia an integral part of Europe, because integration with other countries is the only way we're ever going to be able to achieve goals that, in effect, call for the integration of the entire globe. So you got to think. You have to think, how do your short-term goals affect your long-term goals? And sometimes it means that you have to accept a short-term goal that you don't like, because the long-term goals are more important.
That's right, and that's incredible perspective. Just incredible perspective.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, what shared roles do you believe citizens and government officials and governments have in the United States to foster the spread of these global goals on a global scale?
Well, I think most citizens and most members of the U.S. government would all agree on the goals. Maybe climate change is an exception for some part of the population, but the problem is that we have politicized the goals. These are goals that are like, mom and apple pie. Everybody should agree on, and all you disagree on is how do you get there. Instead, we are in danger of making some of these goals part of the political dialogue, and a part of the, not political dialogue, part of the political confrontation between two political parties. We've idealized. I don't even like that word. We've taken the ideology and substituted it for thinking in some cases. Too much of what we're doing in the United States is we come to regard our political party or our political movement like our football team. We don't care how bad it is. It's my football team, and I'm going to back it. So I honestly don't know. And occasionally there are moments there where I despair, because the rhetoric, the language being used, the emotions coming out are actually making it more and more difficult to cooperate on some very important issues that if you ask the average person on the street, do you think we need to fix this? They'll all say yes, followed by, but the other guy's a bad guy and he doesn't want to fix it. So this is intrinsically what we need to do in the United States, is come to a consensus that whatever our political differences are, we should be working for goals that we all agree on. And here it falls on the leadership of the political parties. They have to tone it down. It can't be that appealing to, say, our favorite word now, appealing to your base is more important than solving problems.
Mm-hmm.
You have to you have to begin with, I'm trying to solve a problem. And at the moment in the current atmosphere, I don't know how we're going to do that. I'm just hoping, against hope maybe, but I'm hoping that this is just a normal sort of temper tantrum that the American body politic is throwing, and it's not normal. At least I hope it doesn't become normal.
Yeah, and we've had other periods in U.S. and global history where we've seen that discourse become, you recall reading about the early days in the U.S. Congress and people acting uncivil.
Yeah, well, to me, the uncivil part
So,
that really bothers me is 1860, and I mean,
right.
that is not the example I'm hoping we should be thinking about. But I worry about it. I wake up sometimes in the middle of the night and say, are we actually in another 1860 moment? I hope not. Not all the circumstances are the same. It's a different population, but still, I mean, we've had another 150 years of American history to further create
Yeah, that's right.
A nation. But nonetheless, if you go back to 1860, you say, wow, that's pretty scary if that's the way it's going to go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. And I'd like to dive a little bit deeper in terms of your expertise as a leader, as a global leader. You have seen leaders, you've dealt with leaders, you are a leader yourself. Patrick, what leadership qualities do you feel are most important when conducting the critical diplomacy that you've alluded to that needs to take place today?
The base of the base quality, the quality that underlies under everything else he does, has to be something that we call empathy right now, which is understanding why is the other guy mad? Why is the other guy angry? Or why is this guy happy? What is it that causes him or her to take a position? You have to understand their history. You have to understand their background. You have to understand their current situation. I mean, Senator Manchin, for example, infuriates people, but unless he can persuade his population that a change in policy would get him reelected, he's not going to do it. This is perfectly human. So it's the underlying part of, you have to understand what drives the other guy in dealing with him. And then you have to have a big picture. The best leaders are the ones who have a really big picture, who understand where they want to be in 20 years' time. And almost it's a little less important on how you're going to get there. It's very important knowing how you're going to get there. But if you don't know where there is, all you're going to do is go on and doing short-term things that don't really change things. And the other important quality is you have to be somebody who loves negative feedback. You got to love people who disagree with you. You've got to love people who tell you, boss, that wasn't such a good idea. I think we see this with Putin right now. I think what killed him in the Ukraine, why things have gone so bad, is I don't think he's getting any negative feedback, because people don't like giving someone like Putin advice that he doesn't want to hear. So the empathy, the negative feedback, and the vision are the three characteristics that a great leader must have. And the other one is charisma. But the charisma has to be in the service of the vision, not it can't be charisma in the service of your own ego. And that is just pure luck. I have no idea how you do that.
So interesting. And so how do you see the stakes of global diplomacy now with the internet and social media different, of course, really completely different than just 20 years ago, let's say?
It makes it much more difficult. It is
why? What is beyond obvious? Like what?
Social media,
the way the digital transformation.
It has made it more difficult to get messages out. The pure volume is overwhelming people. When I was a kid growing up, we had the Washington Post in the morning, we had the Evening Star in the evening, and we had three radio systems: CBS, ABC, and NBC, and that was it. So there was a lot of diversity within them, but everybody was hearing the same information. Now there is so much out there that you're overwhelmed. I find myself, trying very hard to make sure that I get input from as many different sources as possible. And problem is there are now too many sources. And I'm getting 1,000 emails a day sometimes. And about 300 of them are people talking about politics and stuff like that. There's different messages, and there's this cacophony of messages. And as a consequence, it is perfectly normal for somebody who's got a day job to say, well, I'm only going to listen to this particular news program. I'm only going to read this particular stuff coming out on the internet because, I'm busy, and I'm just going to listen to stuff that doesn't make me feel bad, or people that agree with me and it doesn't get me angry. And that makes developing a consensus on what needs to be done much, much more difficult than it was in the past. I too was one of those people who felt that the internet would be liberating and get information out to lots of people. And what happens is we're getting too much information, too much in the sense of humans cannot absorb it. It is more than we were genetically designed, evolution designed us to absorb at any one time. And as a consequence, we find ourselves becoming tribal. It really is tribal. It really is, this is my tribe, this is my football team, and I'm going to fall in on that because it is a lot easier than trying to absorb everything that's out there, particularly since I can't figure out who's telling me the truth and who's right.
And that brings up a very good question as a follow-up. So what is the inherent danger that you see with that? So clearly what you're saying is there's not one trusted source of information that you can go to, that you look to. For example, so many messages around health issues, or, if you X health issue, Google,
right,
5,000 or 5 million different ways you can tackle that specific disease or whatever it is. And if you go to diplomacy, I'm sure you're seeing information and misinformation.
Yes.
And that's not new. That's not new. It's just now the volume of all of that is new.
Right.
And today more than ever, don't you believe that we need, and even companies, and a lot of the types of companies that we deal with are taking a lead in terms of trying to be that trusted source to help sort of do the right thing, whether it's what you talked about with climate change, or with sustainability in general, or with empowering women and girls, and hiring more women in a company, and helping them get on boards, and truly breaking those barriers. I just see what you're saying is an issue in terms of those trusted sources of information.
Right. I just learned a new word last year from my kids: influencer. And influencers have always been around. Cotton Mather was an influencer. Walter Cronkite was an influencer. President Roosevelt, both Presidents Roosevelts were but there are now a lot of influencers. And the way things worked in the world when there were very few influencers was that everybody got to sit at the table, and everybody got heard as well, and everybody sees something in it for himself among the influencers. And somehow we have to find a way to get the larger number of influencers that exist today in the world. I know there's 1 million of them, something like that, around a figurative table of some sort. And I don't know how to do that, but to me, this is the essential if you want to get the world on a single page, on understanding, in very broad terms, understanding what it is that we need to do to be in good shape 100 years from now, because that's what we got to be thinking of. We got to be thinking of our grandchildren, not our kids. We got to be thinking of the well-being of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to develop a consensus. But the consensus has to begin by getting as many of the influencers in the world together. And there are people who don't, there are people who have, it's I'm in it for me, I'm in it for the money, I'm in it for the ego, and who actually have a vested interest in not doing good because it's not to their advantage. And sometimes I sort of despair, how do you deal with this? But we have to deal with it, because right now we are capable of, either in the short run or in the long run, of destroying this planet. And right now, until Star Trek shows up, it's the only planet we got. So we have to. I think the stakes are very high, whether it's climate change, whether it's the threat of nuclear warfare, pick it. It is becoming a world that is much more vulnerable to our activity as human beings. And we have to get our arms around it, and we have to get as many people around the table as possible, and we have to come up with courses of action. I don't even want to call them solutions, but courses of action that means we can muddle through whatever crises are facing us in the future.
Ambassador Patrick Theros, that was the last word. So eloquent and so powerful. You are, my friend, leadership defined. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, George. My very best to you and the family, and look forward to doing this again. See you again.
Likewise. Thank you.